Well, good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson tonight. Crime doesn't pay. That's what they tell you in school, though increasingly there's evidence that maybe it does in fact pay. Consider all those career politicians who somehow wind up rich in the end. And then there's Omar Khadr. If Khadr lived on your street, he'd probably be the richest guy in your neighborhood. How did he make his money? Well, first he joined the Taliban. During a firefight with U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan in 2002, Khadr threw a grenade that killed a Delta Force medic named Christopher Spear. For that, he went to Guantanamo Bay. He later pleaded guilty to murder there. Lucky for Khadr, he was born a Canadian citizen. So after being released from Gitmo, he sued the government of Canada for his imprisonment. And here's the remarkable thing. Canada settled with him. This month, Justin Trudeau's government awarded Khadr more than $10 million and issued an official apology for being mean to him. Prime Minister Trudeau later conceded he had not bothered to talk to Christopher Spear's widow before any of this. Instead, he defended the settlement as a win for human rights. Watch.
I can understand Canadians' concerns about the settlement. In fact, I share those concerns about the money. That's why we settled. The measure of a society, of a just society, is not whether we stand up for people's rights when it's easy or popular to do so. It's whether we recognize rights when it's difficult, when it's unpopular.
Michelle Rempel is a member of the Canadian Parliament, and she joins us tonight. Michelle, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
Is this a measure of the justness of Canada's society, do you think?
Well, first of all, for your viewers here tonight, I want you to know that most Canadians are absolutely outraged about this. They're outraged because of the payment itself, how the payment happened, and the fact that the way that it's happened has probably preempted and prevented Tabitha Spear from seizing any of those assets. So,
assets belonging to the father of this man, to Khadr's father.
That's correct. So, I think while a lot of your viewers have just seen this statement, they should also know that most Canadians, I think, are quite outraged and quite disappointed by this state of affairs.
It doesn't seem just. I mean, there are probably a lot of people in Canada, including some who've probably been mistreated legitimately by the Canadian government, who could use $10.5 million. How did this guy get it?
Well, and the thing to recognize here is this was a settlement. This wasn't any sort of payment that was awarded by a Canadian court. This lawsuit that Mr. Khadr had filed was being litigated, and there was no court ruling, right? This was something that the government decided. And so what was disappointing for me as a legislator and many of my colleagues was that this decision happened after our House of Commons, which is, similar to your Congress,
yes,
rose for the summer. So right now we're not sitting, right? We usually have an opportunity to ask questions like, why did this happen? What was the government's motivation? And that didn't happen. So I think that that's where there's a lot of concern about this particular decision, yes, that it's been made in a bit of a vacuum. And now we're just getting dribs and drabs.
So why was it made? Why did the Prime Minister do that?
That's really a question for him. I think many Canadians would have preferred to have seen this play out in a court of law. The Prime Minister has said that this was done for some sort of, financial reason to save money. But the reality is that this was a decision that was made by his government and not by a court of law. And I think that that's quite confusing and quite outrageous for many, many Canadians.
So there's an effort online in Canada to raise money for the family of
That's right.
Christopher Tabitha Spear, but also yes, for the other soldier who was gravely
That's
wounded.
Right. Spearkids.ca. I think that the last time I checked, there was close to $200,000 that had been raised by the Canadian public. And what you have to understand too, that this is not like a partisan political issue. This is something that people who actually voted for this government are going, I'm not comfortable with this, right? You have to understand that Canada values, the relationship that we have in terms of our men and women in uniform serving shoulder to shoulder with each other. Right. And I think that there's a lot of people that are just going, how did this happen and why? And again, that's a question for our Prime Minister to answer.
Why wouldn't he call the widow of Christopher Spear first?
Again, I'm sure that's something that he should answer for, but I know that our former Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, has reached out to her. I can't imagine being her right now and listening to all of this coverage and having to have those wounds reopened. I think that we have to be cognizant about her and compassionate to her and her family in the first instance here. And then, to me, that's at the core of Canadian outrage over this.
So, I mean, again, as long as we're passing out $10 million checks to people who say they've been wrong, this guy would not even be on the first 100 on that list. So you got to wonder, was this a way of giving the finger to the United States?
I think that this should have played out in a court of law. Mr. Cotter has an appeal to his conviction that's pending in your government. He's had this case in front of the Canadian government. This is a very serious situation all around. There's our Supreme Court has said that his human rights were violated. To me, as a legislator, I want the judiciary to make a decision on this.
Yes.
It hasn't happened here, and I want to be perfectly clear. I think that's where that sense of wrongness is coming from.
Right. Just let the king decide over summer vacation.
Well, we'll have to see.
Michelle Rumpel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Sergeant Lane Morris was the other soldier we alluded to a minute ago who was wounded in that firefight where Christopher Speer was killed. He'll be joining us tomorrow night for his take on the settlement we were just talking about. We hope you had a relaxing weekend, because our political class here in Washington did not. Instead of barbecuing with their children, maybe taking some time to solve the many problems this country faces, they were back on television fretting about the Russian takeover of America.
What do the Russians have politically, financially, and personally on Donald Trump that he fawns over Putin? The American people have a right to know.
I do not want to see our democracy undermined by having the President of the United States colluding, and his officials colluding with Russia.
This love of Putin that this president is showing, and this defense that this president has done, and all of the other things that I've just alluded to, is unseemly.
And we can also say that Donald Trump Jr., what he did was a threat to our democracy and borderline treason.
Borderline treason. Well, Max Blumenthal is an author, a journalist, and a lifelong man of the left. Yet he's become skeptical of the Russian collusion narrative, which he has called destructive and dangerous. Last month, Blumenthal took to an anti-Russia protest on the National Mall here in Washington to find out what the people who were there actually knew about the topic. Here's part of the conversation, an amazing conversation he had with the progressive Maryland Congressman Jamie Raskin.
But you said that Roger Stone hosted a show on RT.
Roger Stone hosted a series on the Russia Propaganda Network. Do you believe that we need
Roger Stone didn't host a show on RT.
You think he's never been on an RT?
But he didn't host a show.
Okay, well, look, you can go over any picayune details you want, but I don't see why it would be in your interest to support an autocratic authoritarian government which is jailing journalists and fighting against freedom around the world.
I think we should tell the people the truth.
Max Blumenthal joins us in studio. I love that exchange because it's similar to so many I've had on this show, where if you call into question a fact being asserted, you're immediately accused of being a handmaiden to Vladimir Putin. So let me just ask the broadest possible question. You're not a Trump voter or supporter. You're a lifelong man on the left, I think it's fair to say, pretty well-known one, and yet you don't think that this Russia story is helpful to the left or makes sense. Why?
Yeah, I mean, we have to talk about the issue of efficacy also, in addition to the fact that I haven't seen any concrete evidence, and Rachel Maddow's dots may never connect. And so, as someone on the left who's actually gone out and protested Trump, I didn't expect this hysteria to completely take over, but now I see what the point is of it. I see Trump as the apotheosis of a failed political establishment, both from the Democrats and the Republicans, pushing corporate trade, pushing permanent war. And I thought the Democrats should have responded with a big narrative against permanent war and for economic equality. Instead, they're pushing Russia's scandal-mongering nonstop. It's subsumed all of the progressive grassroots movements I believed in, and it's basically buried the left in a militaristic narrative that ambitious figures like Jamie Raskin are advancing. Mark my words, Tucker, when Trump is gone, this narrative, this Russia hysteria, will be repurposed by the political establishment to attack the left and anyone on the left. Sanders-like politician who steps out of line on the issues of permanent war or corporate free trade, things like that, will be painted as Russia puppets. So this is very dangerous, and people who are progressive, who are falling into it, need to know what the long-term consequences of this cynical narrative are.
It seems virtually everyone on the left in Washington, with some exceptions, you're one, I know a couple others, but I know people who I think of as reasonable, I don't agree with them, but who seem to really believe that Vladimir Putin was in control of the last election. Do you think they believe it?
I don't know. I think I can't speak for other people. I'm not a mind reader. But there's definitely a political class in Washington that sees Russia scandal mongering as a silver bullet to take out Trump. And then you have the Democrats who are basically the Democratic establishment that came in and took out Keith Ellison, the corporate sellout establishment that can't agree on a big economic message, that doesn't favor single payer. So this is just convenient because this gives them a way of opposing Trump without having to do anything remotely progressive.
It's a little bit surprising from a perspective of someone in the media to see big news organizations full of smart people who I thought were pretty skeptical in a good way refuse to ask any of the basic questions, and instead, when you press them, say, well, some number of intelligence agencies said so. I haven't seen the evidence, but I believe them. When did that change? What is that about?
Yeah, I mean, you see a bootlicking press and a bootlicking kind of liberal opposition that believes all intelligence agencies and doesn't ask questions from these anonymous officials. I mean, you'll see on CNN a segment, U.S. officials say Russian spying is ramping up. I don't know, are Russian spies taking Adderall now? But there's never any clear sourcing. Never any sources on the record, and then we see stories retracted, like that the Russians hacked into our national electricity grid. Then the Washington Post said it was Burlington, Vermont's electricity grid. Then they retracted the story. So it's very hard to keep track of it, but what they've done with this scandal mongering, in addition to kind of pushing away a progressive narrative, is create the sense among a lot of people who pay attention that there is Russian collusion, that we were attacked by Russia, and that we actually have to respond, if not with expanded sanctions, which I think is very dangerous and harms average people, but with military response. We just saw Paul Begala on CNN calling for blowing up the Russian intelligence
agencies. And you've seen members of Congress call this an act of war. Finally, you're a pretty, not just a member of the left, but fairly well known. What kind of response have you received after saying things like this in public?
Well, I'll probably get called a Putin puppet after this show. I mean, that's pretty much all they can say. But I'd like to have a debate about the evidence. I would like to talk about the evidence behind this, but I also want to talk about whether it's a good idea to support Democrats like Ben Cardin, who are saying that this is a political Pearl Harbor and we should respond, whether it's a good idea to expand NATO into little countries like Montenegro, whether it's a good idea to be funding jihadist proxies in Syria to hurt Russia. Thomas Friedman in the New York Times called for supporting territorial ISIS in Syria to hurt Russia and Iran. And that's where this narrative is leading. It seems to be, from a purely progressive, anti-war, anti-imperial position, a disastrous narrative that will have long-term consequences for the left in this country.
And there's no debate. So my son will be required to give his life to defend the territorial integrity of Montenegro?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe it's a good idea. Maybe we should debate it, but we're not.
Yeah. I mean,
Vex Blumenthal, that was super interesting. Thanks for coming on.
Thanks.
Trump administration now approaching its 6-month mark. Congress still trying to hammer out a replacement to Obamacare. What is really in the current version of the bill? Do you have any idea? Most people don't. We're going to sit down with the HHS Secretary Tom Price in just a second. Also, refugee resettlement programs have inundated a small town in Pennsylvania with the Roma gypsies. How's that going? I'll tell you just ahead. Well, Republicans spent many years vowing they'd immediately repeal and replace Obamacare if voters returned them to power. Maybe you voted for them for that. When Barack Obama was still president, the House of Representatives repeatedly passed replacement bills, knowing they'd never become law. But now Republicans do have the power to do all of that, to replace Obamacare, and they're having a hard time. The Senate still hasn't passed a repeal bill, and that may be a good thing, according to the polls, which show that only 17% of Americans approve of the GOP plan, to the extent they know what it is. To put that in perspective, that's 5 points lower than the approval rating in this country for Vladimir Putin. The question is, what would this plan do for Americans? Some confusion about that still. Health and Human Services Secretary Tom Price joins us tonight to clear it up. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary, for coming on.
Thanks, Tucker. Good to be with you.
So you're trying to sell this plan to the public, but also to the Congress, and it's hard. It's always hard with this stuff. So if you were to narrow it down, tell me what the chief aim of this bill is. Is it to improve health outcomes, to control prices, or to expand coverage?
It's to stick to those principles of healthcare, making healthcare affordable, accessible, of the highest quality, and provide choices for patients. So it protects patients, provides more choices for patients, lowers costs, and strengthens Medicaid. That's it in a nutshell.
Okay, but but you didn't add to that expanding coverage.
Well, coverage comes when people have something that they want to purchase.
Right.
Coverage doesn't come when Washington tells you what to buy. The way that you get people to get health coverage is that you provide them with a product that they actually want, and that's what this goal. That's what the purpose of this bill of reform is as well.
Do you think that people, and I don't know the answer to this because I haven't seen the polling, but is there evidence that people in the last election voted to replace Democratic leadership with Donald Trump because they wanted more choices in healthcare?
Well, they certainly wanted Obamacare to go away.
Yeah, for sure. They wanted Obama. It was never broke 50%. Now it's actually above 50%. Now that we're debating this,
but they wanted it to go away. It's important to know why they wanted it to go away.
Right.
They wanted it to go away because prices are up. Choices are down. Folks don't have the kind of health coverage that they want. They may have an insurance card, but they don't have care because they can't afford the deductible. So there are all sorts of an array of things that are wrong with Obamacare, with the ACA, and that's what we're trying to fix. Now, it's not just through this bill. That's what's important for people to appreciate as well. This bill is one isolated activity. It's an important one. It's vital to have it, but it's only one isolated activity that's going in place with this administration to make it so that the health system actually responds to patients.
But I mean, I think it's worth paying attention to it. It's meaningful. So how would Trump voters be affected by it? West Virginia, for example, is like 68%, I think, of West Virginians voted for Donald Trump. About 30% of this whole state is on Medicaid. This legislation, I think, would reduce Medicaid payments. I think that's a fair thing to say. So how would they fare under this, West Virginia?
For those individuals on Medicaid who were eligible for Medicaid previously, there's essentially no change whatsoever. Over a period of time, those individuals that are on Medicaid but were able-bodied adults, they would transition to a personal market, a private insurance market that would actually be more responsive to them and allow them to purchase the kind of coverage that they want. Virtually everybody's prices will come down for the premiums that they pay for their coverage, and they will get coverage that's more responsive to them. So we strengthen the Medicaid system, we drive prices down, we increase choices. That's what patient-centered healthcare is all about.
So if this bill passed tomorrow in its current form, I know it's still being formulated, there would be no net loss of Medicaid dollars or people on Medicaid in the state of West Virginia.
Actually, for the next 2 years, there'd be no change at all to Medicaid.
Right.
Changes begin in 2020, and at that time, then Medicaid would grow. The amount of money for Medicaid would grow at a rate that's equivalent to the consumer price index that's for the medical services that are provided in this country. So that would be a rate that would actually cover the cost of the increased growth within the Medicaid system. Over a period of 7 or 8 years, that drops down to just CPI, Consumer Price Index.
Right.
But over that period of time, the individuals that would transition from Medicaid to the private market would then be able to have the coverage that they want, and that, if they needed it, because of their low income, would be subsidized by what's called a stability fund. So more choices, lower costs, strengthening Medicare, making it so that we can have patient-centered health care in this system.
And so not fewer people covered by health insurance.
I believe. There's no way to predict it. In fact, CBO has a terrible record on predicting how much coverage. But I believe that there would be more people, more individuals being able to be covered with the system that's currently being contemplated in the Senate than currently.
So who loses? I see you've described who wins, but of course someone always loses. Who loses?
Well, the folks who want government to run your health care, they lose. Folks who want the insurance. Who are they?
Yeah.
They're the folks in this town right now who are opposing this, by and large, the individuals who are not in favor.
So they lose because they're disappointed, but who loses money on this?
The money gets spread differently, and the amount of money is actually more because, as I said, the increase in Medicaid is up by Consumer Price Index, and individuals are able to get to select the kind of coverage that they want. So choices make it so that the market of health coverage, if you will, responds to patients, not to insurance companies and not to government. That's the key.
How far are we from single payer nationally for catastrophic coverage? I mean, honestly, I mean, I'm even hearing conservatives
for catastrophic
always
coverage
been against.
only?
Yeah. Single payer for catastrophic coverage.
Yeah, I think that the consequences of that actually reduce the ability for you to get the kind of coverage that you want for the services that you.
Well, that may be absolutely right, but this is partly a political question.
Two, I think the answer to that question has to wait until the outcome of this debate. If the Congress and the president are able if Congress is able to pass a bill and put it on the president's desk, then I think that you will be a long way away from a single payer.
For sure, but if you don't, we're closer to it. And would you be for it or no?
the devil's in the details. I'm not for something where the government decides what individuals, what's covered for individuals.
Right.
Because I know that when that happens, as happens in every other system that has it, then the government decides what equals health care.
Yeah. The
and
lobbyists
you don't.
decide. Yeah, and they get rich too. I've noticed that.
Well, that may be a byproduct.
Yeah, they're all my neighbors. Mr. Secretary, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Tucker.
Next up, a small town in Pennsylvania trying to cope with streets covered, pardon us now, but it's true, in human feces and headless chickens after immigration officials settled dozens of Roma, you may call them gypsies, in their town. Is the federal government failing its own citizens, or they need to just grow up and start appreciating diversity? We'll talk to an American Roma. Well, in the last 2 months, Roma, more commonly known as gypsies, have been settled in California, Pennsylvania, seeking asylum, saying they suffered racism in their native Romania. The integration is not going well. According to residents, the Roma have little regard either for the law or public decency. Citizens say they defecate in public, chop the heads off chickens, leave trash everywhere, and more. They're upset. Some of them are anyway. George Eli is a filmmaker, an author, activist, and an American Roma. He created the documentary Searching for the Fourth Nail, a movie about the Roma community. George Eli joins us tonight. George, thanks a lot for coming on.
Well, thank you, Tucker, for inviting me. I appreciate it. I don't think I would be able to get out of this. My mother would have definitely killed me since she's such a huge fan of yours. So, but thank you for having me.
Nice open, George. I like that.
It's the truth. And you know
say
what?
Hi to your mom for me.
I will. I'm not even, I didn't even tell her. She's probably screaming right now, just so you know.
It's hilarious. So I'm not, look, I'm not anti-Roma, but I am pro-American citizen.
And so are American Rome. I'm an American Rome, and my family's been here for 100 years. So.
I know that you are, but the group that is settled in California, Pennsylvania doesn't seem interested at all in integrating, and so why wouldn't American citizens have a right to be upset about that?
Tucker, American citizens have a right to be of anybody coming into their towns and it's making havoc. I can't comment on what exactly is happening in the town because I just learned of it through your producers. But I can say that the Roma people are, the majority of them are nonviolent. They're not violent people. Now, as far as the town can go, I'm sure they can be concerned. I think both parties are suffering right now from a little bit of culture shock. So we can't discard, as a Roma person, I can't discard what's happening in the town and they're not understanding, and then for to be fearful of like, okay, well, what's happening here? Because immigrations and immigrants are one thing, but these people, you know, they seem to be a little bit of not following the law. But it's important to understand.
But it's not fun. Look, and I agree with you. I've spent time around the Roma, and I've never heard anybody say they were violent. So I think that seems right to me. But I have heard a lot of people mention, and I hate to say it, but public defecation. There are a lot of news stories about this from around the world. I'm serious. Going back a long time in the UK and here, where groups of Roma settle in a new community and then defecate on playgrounds or sidewalks or on their front steps. That seems to me a hostile act. Basically what you're saying, these are countries that have indoor plumbing, like there are options. When you do that, you're saying you and your mores.
Tucker,
what's that about?
To respond to your question, like I said, I cannot respond to, because I've never witnessed it, and I've been Roma all my life, and my family's been Roma all my life, and we use bathrooms, and I've been to Europe many times, and it's kind of respond to something that I've never seen as a Roma person. I've never witnessed any of my family do such a thing. And the way you're making it sound, with all due respect, or maybe the papers are making it sound, is like they're doing it in protest. I don't, if in fact it's happening.
Well,
I don't think so. I'm here to talk about...
Over a number of different years. I mean, there are photographs of it actually online.
If you want to talk about historically...
What is that about? It's not something that you need to do, so you have to assume it's a statement is deeply offensive, of course, to the people who live in the community.
You ask me what is it about. I can't respond on something so vague and vast. Why does people...
There's nothing vague about it. There are pictures. There are pictures of it, which I will not direct.
What I can say is this. Okay. What I can say is that a lot of these Romanian Roma are coming from the rural parts of Romania, where there's not a lot of running water, and there's not a lot. And you can look at my film and see. that this happens. There's not a lot of electricity. These are very rural areas. If the people in Pennsylvania think that this is in protest or this is just because this is just a people adjusting to a new culture.
But I wonder if that's true, though. No, because this is I'm interested in the subject, so I'm sure most of our viewers know this is a distinct ethnic group originally from the Indian subcontinent, but they've been distinct.
It's important to understand, Tucker, that was over 1,000 years ago, and the Roma people are inherently European.
Well, no, I'm not discounting that. I'm merely saying this has been a distinct group for 1,000 years that actually hasn't assimilated, for the most part, into the cultures in which it's been hosted. And so I wonder why we think they're going to assimilate in Pennsylvania.
Because that is that statement that you have is not exactly true. First of all, there are over 1 million Roma in North America, and you never hear any reports of that. Okay, but in Eastern Europe, where there are the majority, they are treated very badly. It's worse than the African American plight here in the 50s because there's no economy. They can't even be the help. Okay, so, and again, these are rural areas that they're coming from. But the Roma that are in Western European countries, Great Britain, France, and Spain, the ones that were born there and are basically Spanish and, French natives, that doesn't happen in the more progressive countries.
But we can agree that when you come to Pennsylvania, you can't go on the sidewalk or on a playground, right? I mean, why can't, do you think that we're secure enough with our own mores that we can just say, hey, knock it off?
Yeah. Listen, Roma are they can adapt, but what you have to understand, they're coming from a culture that hates them, and they're not going to. Even though they hear great things about America, I think America is the best country in the world, and I wouldn't be able to become what I've become if it wasn't for this country. And they don't understand that yet. Now, again, we cannot discard the people of Pennsylvania.
They don't understand that. What are they doing here?
I'm not going to see. I'm not going to say that they just defecate in the street, because I never seen reports of that. There's pictures that you're telling me that I have not seen. But what I can say is that when we say that they're basically not Roma and they're not Romanian immigrants, that is like putting an emphasis on the Roma people and a stereotype that's not fair.
Look, I'm not trying to be unfair. I just think
I don't think you are,
American citizens have rights.
I don't think you're
have rights too.
Right,
all right, George, we are out of time, but I want you to say hi to your mom for me. And thanks for coming on today.
Hi, I'm on the show, and I don't think he's going to marry you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great one.
More drama, if you can believe it, at Evergreen State College in the state of Washington. Up next, we'll show you a student who says she is being silenced due to her skin color, as well as a professor at that school who says they're not extreme enough. Stay tuned. Time now for campus craziness. The news out of Evergreen State College in Washington really is a metaphor for what's happening on the left more broadly. It is bizarre. So bizarre, it feels like a Twilight Zone episode where up is down, black is white, and howling mobs represent free speech and tolerance. Sadly, of course, this is not television. This week, an Evergreen student told trustees how she is vilified and silenced solely because of her race. Keep in mind, this is happening in America. Meanwhile, a professor claimed that Evergreen simply isn't extreme enough. That's the real problem. Watch.
My name is Mackenzie, and I'm a current student at Evergreen. I have been to several meetings to speak. I've been told several times that I'm not allowed to speak because I'm white. This school seems to focus so much on race that is actually becoming more racist. Because I choose not to focus on race, I have actually been labeled a racist and a white supremacist. And if anyone took the time to actually know me, it's not true at all.
The work toward equity and inclusion was and is not proceeding fast enough for our students and frustrates them and staff and faculty as well. I want to advocate that each of us, all of us, strategically and thoughtfully choose to listen, find, and tell the stories of what happened, stories that understand social change to be messy and righteous, difficult and necessary.
That's what fascism looks like in 2017. John Daniel Davidson is a senior correspondent at The Federalist, and he joins us now. John, part of me feels a little guilty for giving so much airtime to this insignificant college in the Pacific Northwest, but I think it's important because I think it says something much broader about what's happening to the American left. This is a pretty familiar series of steps we're watching. Do you recognize this?
Absolutely. This corresponds to a pattern we've seen playing out all over the country over the last couple of years in Berkeley, in Maine, for coast to coast. I mean, even at Mizzou, a couple of years back, it started with Black Lives Matter protests. And Evergreen is a special case, but as you say, it's kind of a canary in the coal mine. Evergreen has been kind of a kooky liberal college for decades, but what's happening there is kind of the logical consequence of left-wing radical theory playing out on college campuses all over the country.
So I think one thing that professor, the one who described violence threats as, quote, righteous, one thing she said I think does point to the truth of what's going on here. She said, in effect, our students have been told to expect that things are going to change much faster than they've actually changed. Isn't that part of it? Students have been taught that the country is irredeemably racist and that they have a responsibility to make everything perfect immediately. If you tell kids that, why should you be surprised when they riot?
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's also a consequence of these students being very sheltered. It's not just college. They've gone through high school in most cases without ever really being challenged. So their biases have been confirmed by their teachers from a very young age. College, which is supposed to be a time when you expand your horizons, when you challenge your assumptions, has never really happened for them in that way. They've had their biases confirmed and reinforced. And as you say, they've been told that change needs to happen really fast and a specific kind of change. And when they encounter people they disagree with, they kind of lose their minds. And that's what we see in Evergreen. That's what we've seen at Middlebury College. That's what we've seen at UC Berkeley. It's a big problem, and it comes from kind of a shelteredness in college students today.
For sure. But you're also, I think we've reached the stage in the revolution where it's consume itself. The snake is eating its own tail. I mean, there are no conservatives at Evergreen. The guy they were mad at, Professor Brett Weinstein, is a totally sincere, I think, principled, but progressive. He's a lefty. He's not a Trump voter. He's not a right-winger in any sense. And now they're trying to kick him off campus. So, are you struck by how this is kind of the left versus liberals?
Yeah, I mean, it's exactly as you say. This is sort of the left eating its own tail, which is, as we say before, canary in the coal mine. This is the logical consequence of this kind of rhetoric. If you're taught that speech is violence, then you will resort to violence to suppress speech you don't like. Exactly. And that's what's happening here. It's very anti-enlightenment. We spent centuries getting to the point where we don't burn people at the stake for the things they say. And that's exactly what's happening here.
No, that's really nicely put. And how would you like to run the Democratic Party with all of these people in it? Boy, I'd be afraid. They've unleashed forces they can't control, and I'd be afraid if I were them. John, thank you for that. That was insightful.
Thanks.
A baby in Canada has become the first one born without any official sex. Is that progressive? Is it lunatic? Are your children next? We'll talk to a psychotherapist about it after the break. Well, for all of our lives, we've lived in a world of boys and girls, but that is changing along with everything else in 2017. In Canada, the country directly to our north, the parents of a baby successfully petitioned to have that child given an ID card with no sex listed, insisting that that is for the baby to decide. Things may not stop there. They probably won't. The Gender Free ID Coalition is calling on the Canadian government to eliminate sex and gender classifications for all children throughout that country. Are we ready for a world here where baby boys and girls are replaced by baby somethings? Nell Gibbon-Daly is a psychotherapist, and she joins us tonight. Nell, thanks a lot for coming on.
Thank you so much, Tucker, for having me. It's a pleasure.
So these are questions that didn't exist like 18 months ago. Homo sapiens have been around 300,000 years, and for the most part, it was kind of obvious who the boys and girls were. But we've decided in a very short period of time that none of that is real, and we're changing it, because why?
Well, to be honest with you, we believe that people who are considered intersex, people who are born with both sets of genitalia, have existed throughout human history.
For sure.
So the federal government just released a study in 2016 that 1.4 million people now identify themselves as transgendered, and Canada isn't the only place that's doing this. Legislation was just introduced in Washington, D.C. and in New York over the past couple of months to also have parents have the right to, on a child's birth certificate, not just say that the child is male or female, but also X or unidentified.
But I think you may be conflating two things.
Sure.
So the number of intersex births in this country, that is where a child has both sets, partially or fully formed, of genitalia, is maybe a little over 700 per year out of about 4 million births. So it's less than 1/10 of 1%. So very small numbers, tiny number. Okay.
Sorry, Tucker.
And probably we can assume that's been consistent through time. But and nobody is suggesting that you force a sex onto a child whose sex is not clear. But for most kids, overwhelming number of kids, it is clear. So why should we pretend it's not clear? I guess that's the question.
I think it's a great question. I mean, as to your statistic, I had trouble finding accurate numbers as to how many children are born in this country who are intersex.
Right.
I got numbers that say 1 out of every 1,500 births, also 1 out of every 100 births, where there is some sort of either anomaly.
Hold on. 1 out of every 100 births has there is separate sets of genitalia.
Well,
I don't think
not
that's
necessarily.
right.
It doesn't have to go that far. So there could be some sort of like genetic, I don't want to say abnormality, but an anomaly, right? Like a chromosomal anomaly that it's not so clear, meaning that gender is not necessarily based on genitalia. And so I think your other question though is, should we give people the right to say we're going to raise a child as non-binary, meaning we're not going to raise a child as male or female, which is something that the couple in Canada is
right, because
doing.
I mean there are legitimate, I think, medical situations, and you've just described some of them where it's an open question, and I would never deny that, and of course you want to respond compassionately, but that's not what this case is about. This case is about the idea that you get to choose what your sex is, which is a denial of biology, and there's also, and I think as a psychotherapist you'd agree, a cost to a child. If you say to a little kid, I don't know if you're male or female, you decide, I don't think you're going to get a good outcome a lot of the time at all. That's why people have never done that through human history.
You know, the couple that is, or the person who's deciding to do this with their child up in Canada, the point, and I spoke to them on the phone, the point that they are making is that this child is a spiritual being having a human experience, not a human being having a spiritual experience. So it's actually a very spiritual endeavor. And what it's saying is that let's just let the child be a child, and eventually the child will decide what it wants to be, how much it wants to identify as a boy or how much it wants to identify as a girl. And this person is also saying that it's not that I'm not going to raise a child as a girl or a boy. I'm just going to say to the child, you just be a child, just be an individual for a while. Let's not have the government interfere with who you are. Let's not put a set of preconceived notions about who you are onto you. Let's just let you develop as a human being, and eventually you can decide whether or not you want to be a boy or girl or non-binary.
Yeah. For choice, and there are a lot of biological realities that I'm sad about, that I would change about I'm sincere, that I would change about myself. And so I'm not attacking anybody, but don't you think that biological reality matters, and lying to kids and telling them, actually you could be 6'7", or you could have blue eyes instead of brown, or whatever. I mean, those are lies, and it's never a good idea to lie to kids, is it?
I don't think it's a lie. I think it's actually giving children more information at a younger age than we traditionally have, right? So it's like, I'm going to give a comparison. It's like raising a child to not assume that they're heterosexual, right? The way I've raised my children is to say, like, I don't know what they're going to be, and I'm not just going to assume that they're gay or they're straight. I just give them lots of information, expose them to lots of people.
There's a difference here, because whereas, we don't know a lot about the biology of homosexuality, we know a lot about the biology of sex, because we know that it begins on the chromosomal level. Like, there's a science piece to this that's being ignored by people who I thought believed in science. So that's why I'm a little bit confused.
I don't think it's being ignored. I think what we're seeing, though, in the federal study and what's come out in terms of the Census Bureau is that if 1.4 million people don't identify with the gender marker that they were given at birth, we have to take note of that and say what's going on, that there's a fluidity about gender, and it's not necessarily rooted in biology.
Why does that not extend to race?
Tell me what you mean by that. You're going to have to explain that one to me.
If I can say I'm a woman, why can't I say I'm a Chinese woman and be taken every bit as seriously? And I'm not mocking you. I'm making a sincere point, and it's a sincere question. What's the difference?
You know, I think it's a great question. I mean, I think as we progress as a society, some of these labels that we're putting on things, and I can't necessarily go to the race question, although one of the things that I've loved about your program as of late is that you're really into this idea of having a more inclusive society and being less separatist in terms of race, that we should be more inclusive. And I think that that's what we're saying. We're creating a space at the table for people to be to have optionality in terms of how they want to identify themselves.
Okay. Well, as long as we're still science-based, then, you know, as a child of the Enlightenment,
it's not taking science off the table. It's just saying, can we look at it from another perspective?
Okay. Nell, thanks for coming on today.
Thanks, Tucker, so much for having me. I appreciate it.
A U.S. veteran tried to stop thieves at a Home Depot. Now he's looking for a new job.
You too.
We'll tell you that sad story just ahead. We told you at the start of the show how crime is starting to pay, as demonstrated by a Canadian terrorist and countless members of Congress. You know what doesn't pay, though? Being an honest person who tries to stop crime. The 7-year-old veteran's been fired by Home Depot because he dared to confront shoplifters at his store. Until last month, Jim Tinney worked at a Home Depot in Pearland, Texas. During his shift, he saw 3 men running off with thousands of dollars in tools. He says his Army training kicked in and he chased them while throwing a paint roller at them. The men got away, and so far the only man to pay for their crime has been him, Tinney. Rather than praising him for defending the store's merchandise, not to mention its honor, Home Depot fired him 2 weeks later, saying he violated a strict company policy not to pursue shoplifters for some reason. At 70, Tinney says he's struggling to find another job. If only he'd killed U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan. Instead, maybe he'd be getting rich from Canada. Bitter. That's about it for us tonight. Good night from Washington. Our friends over at The 5 are ready to go from New York. We'll see you tomorrow.